Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for imagining possibilities, yet this same capacity often becomes the primary obstacle to actualizing those possibilities. The phenomenon of hesitation before beginning something new represents far more than simple reluctance or laziness. This hesitation emerges from fundamental aspects of how our minds process uncertainty, evaluate risk, and maintain psychological equilibrium. Understanding why we freeze at the threshold of new endeavors requires examining several interconnected psychological mechanisms that operate largely outside conscious awareness. These mechanisms evolved to protect us, but in modern contexts, they frequently prevent us from pursuing goals that carry minimal actual danger and significant potential benefit. The architecture of anticipatory anxiety. When contemplating a new venture, the human mind engages in what researchers call prospective thinking. This involves simulating possible futures and attempting to predict outcomes. However, this simulation process contains a systematic bias. The mind generates far more detailed scenarios of potential failure than success. This asymmetry exists because the brain allocates disproportionate resources to threat detection. Negative outcomes historically carried greater survival implications than positive ones. Missing an opportunity to gather extra food mattered less than failing to notice a predator. Consequently, our cognitive architecture prioritizes imagining what could go wrong. The result manifests as anticipatory anxiety, a state of heightened physiological arousal triggered not by present danger, but by imagined future scenarios. The body responds to these mental simulations as though they represent real threats. Heart rate increases, cortisol levels rise, and attention narrows. Paradoxically, this response, designed to help us confront danger, instead convinces us to avoid the situation entirely. A common manifestation of starting fear involves the belief that more preparation is required. The mind constructs a compelling narrative. Beginning now would be premature. Additional research, planning, or skill development must occur first. This reasoning appears rational, even prudent, yet this preparation phase often extends indefinitely. Each completed preparatory task reveals another that seems necessary. The threshold for ready enough recedes continuously into the future. This pattern reflects an unconscious strategy for avoiding the anxiety associated with actual commencement. The preparation narrative serves a psychological function beyond its ostensible purpose. Preparing feels productive while maintaining the comfortable position of not yet having risked anything. As long as we remain in the preparation phase, we cannot fail at the actual endeavor. Potential remains intact, unblemished by reality. This mechanism operates particularly strongly in domains where outcomes are uncertain or where we suspect our abilities may prove insufficient. The indefinite preparation phase preserves our positive self-image while preventing its confrontation with actual performance data. New endeavors often appear in consciousness as monolithic entities, massive, undifferentiated challenges that must be confronted all at once. This perception severely distorts reality. Most complex activities consist of numerous smaller components, many of which are individually manageable. When the mind represents a task as a unified whole, it must process all associated demands simultaneously. This creates cognitive overload. The brain, attempting to simulate execution of the entire endeavor at once, becomes overwhelmed by the sheer volume of considerations. This overwhelm then gets interpreted as evidence that the task exceeds our capabilities. This cognitive distortion explains why the same person might feel capable of running errands, responding to emails, and cooking dinner, each manageable tasks, yet feel completely overwhelmed by starting a business or learning a language. The latter categories trigger holistic processing, while the former permit step-by-step consideration. The magnitude problem intensifies when we focus on the distance between current state and desired end state. Visualizing the entire gap creates a sense of impossibility. The mind struggles to construct a path across such distance and concludes the journey cannot be made. Every action we take generates information about who we are. Beginning something new forces confrontation with aspects of identity that were previously theoretical. Someone who considers themselves intelligent but has never attempted difficult intellectual work exists in a comfortable state of unverified potential. Starting reveals whether that self-concept matches reality. This creates profound psychological risk. Our sense of self provides stability and coherence to experience. Information that contradicts core self-beliefs triggers significant distress. The prospect of discovering we are not who we believed ourselves to be generates powerful avoidance motivation. This mechanism operates even when the self-concept seems negative. Someone who believes they always fail might avoid starting new things precisely because succeeding would destabilize their identity. The known self, even when painful, feels safer than the unknown self that might emerge from new experiences. The identity protection mechanism explains why fear of starting often intensifies when the domain matters personally. Beginning something we care about deeply stakes more identity capital on the outcome. If we fail at something trivial, the implications for self-concept remain limited. Failure at something central to how we define ourselves threatens psychological foundation. Before starting, potential negative outcomes exist as vague possibilities. The mind knows something could go wrong, but lacks specifics. Paradoxically, this vagueness amplifies anxiety. The undefined nature of the threat prevents the development of specific coping strategies. Beginning transforms vague dread into concrete reality. The specific challenges that emerge, while potentially difficult, are at least knowable. The mind can evaluate them, plan responses, and take action. The shift from abstract threat to concrete problem typically reduces rather than increases psychological distress. This represents one of the central paradoxes of starting fear. The anticipation of beginning generates more anxiety than the activity itself. The cognitive and emotional resources devoted to avoiding commencement often far exceed what the actual endeavor would require. Multiple studies across different domains consistently demonstrate this pattern. People report higher anxiety levels before starting than during engagement with the task. The anticipatory period activates anxiety systems without providing any outlet for anxiety's action-promoting function. Once engagement begins, anxiety either dissipates or transforms into arousal that supports performance. The transition from contemplation to action involves a qualitative shift in psychological state. Before starting, all processing occurs in abstract mental space. After starting, processing becomes grounded in concrete reality. This shift fundamentally alters the subjective experience of the endeavor. The first action, however small, breaks the cycle of imaginative catastrophizing. The mind must now process actual sensory information rather than simulated possibilities. Attention shifts from internal simulation to external environment. This shift typically reduces anxiety because concrete reality, even when challenging, is less threatening than unlimited imagination. The first action also initiates momentum. Physical movement and tangible progress activate reward systems that were dormant during the contemplation phase. Even minimal progress generates positive feedback that encourages continuation. The psychological state after taking the first step differs markedly from the state before it. This explains why the initial moment of starting represents the highest psychological barrier. The first sentence, the first phone call, the first step outside, these carry disproportionate psychological weight. Once crossed, subsequent actions require progressively less activation energy. Before starting, infinite possibilities exist. We could approach the task in countless ways, each with unknown outcomes. This abundance of options, rather than being liberating, often becomes paralyzing. The mind attempts to evaluate too many possibilities simultaneously and becomes gridlocked. Beginning collapses this infinite option space into a single path. Not the perfect path, not necessarily even a good path, but a specific path. This reduction dramatically decreases cognitive load. Instead of comparing infinite alternatives, the mind now only needs to navigate the chosen route and make adjustments as needed. The psychological relief of option space reduction explains why people often report feeling better immediately after starting, even when the task proves difficult. The burden of infinite choice has been lifted. The question is no longer which of countless approaches to take, but simply what to do next in the current approach. This mechanism suggests that optimization should occur after starting rather than before. Attempting to choose the optimal approach from a completely external standpoint requires impossible amounts of information. Starting with an adequate approach and refining based on actual experience proves far more cognitively efficient. Starting serves as reality testing. Abstract fears and concerns that seemed overwhelming in imagination often prove manageable when encountered directly. The actual difficulty of tasks frequently differs from the imagined difficulty, sometimes harder, often easier, but almost always different in character. This reality testing provides crucial information that cannot be obtained through contemplation alone. We cannot accurately simulate how we will respond to challenges we have never faced. Our predictions about our capabilities, emotional responses, and problem-solving effectiveness remain hypothetical until tested. Many people discover that beginning reveals resources they did not know they possessed. Facing actual challenges activates adaptive capacities that remain dormant during contemplation. Creativity, resilience, and competence often emerge more fully under real demands than theoretical ones. The reality testing function explains why experiential knowledge differs fundamentally from theoretical knowledge. Reading about something or imagining doing it never fully prepares us for the actual experience. Beginning provides the only reliable path to accurate understanding. The conventional conception treats starting as a discrete event, a moment when we transition from not doing to doing. This framing creates a psychological cliff that must be leapt across. The mind balks at such discontinuous transitions. A more accurate model understands starting as a gradual process of increasing engagement. The boundary between not started and started is far less distinct than it appears. Thinking about the task, gathering materials, creating space to work, these activities exist on a continuum with the real work. Recognizing this continuum reduces the psychological magnitude of the starting moment. Rather than a binary transition requiring massive activation energy, starting becomes a gentle slope of incremental engagement. Each small action slightly increases involvement until, almost imperceptibly, full engagement has occurred. This reframe proves particularly useful when paralysis sets in. Instead of demanding a complete state change, we can ask what the smallest possible movement toward the task might be. Opening the relevant document, touching the equipment, standing in the right location. These micro-actions lower the barrier while preserving forward momentum. Each instance of avoiding starting reinforces the pattern. The temporary relief of anxiety that follows avoidance acts as a reward, strengthening the avoidance response. Over time, the threshold for starting increases as the avoidance pattern becomes more deeply ingrained. This creates a particularly problematic dynamic because the longer we wait, the more the task becomes associated with anxiety and avoidance. The project we have been avoiding for weeks carries more psychological weight than one we considered yesterday. Time crystallizes dread into increasingly solid barriers. Breaking this loop requires interrupting the pattern despite the anxiety, not after it subsides. Waiting for anxiety to decrease before starting maintains the avoidance cycle. Starting while anxious demonstrates that the task can be engaged despite discomfort, gradually weakening the anxiety response through exposure. The neurobiology of avoidance learning supports this approach. Avoidance prevents the extinction of fear responses. Only through approach behavior, engaging with the feared situation, can the brain learn that the anticipated catastrophe does not materialize. Each successful engagement slightly reduces the anxiety associated with subsequent engagement. Perfectionism frequently underlies starting fear. The belief that performance must meet exacting standards before we can legitimately begin often masks deeper anxieties. If the standard is high enough, it becomes impossible to meet, and therefore provides a permanent justification for not starting. Beginning with permission for imperfection removes this obstacle. Accepting that the first attempt will be flawed, perhaps severely, eliminates the need to achieve excellence immediately. The question becomes not whether we can do it perfectly, but simply whether we can do it at all. This shift proves psychologically profound. It transforms the endeavor from a test of adequacy into a learning process. Mistakes become expected data rather than evidence of failure. The pressure to perform flawlessly dissolves, replaced by curiosity about what we will discover through engagement. Paradoxically, accepting imperfection often leads to better outcomes than demanding perfection. The freedom to experiment, make mistakes, and adjust course produces more learning and skill development than the paralysis of perfectionist standards. Quality emerges through iteration, not immaculate initial execution. The fear of starting represents a natural psychological response to uncertainty and potential threat. Understanding its mechanisms does not eliminate it, but provides tools for working with it effectively. The anxiety serves an evolutionary function, even when that function has become maladaptive in modern contexts. The consistent finding across psychological research and human experience confirms that the anticipatory period contains more suffering than the doing. The catastrophes we imagine rarely materialize. The inadequacies we fear often prove manageable. The complexity that seems overwhelming typically reveals structure once we engage directly. Beginning changes the psychological landscape completely. Abstract dread transforms into concrete challenge. Infinite possibility collapses into navigable path. Theoretical inadequacy meets actual capability. This transformation cannot occur through thought alone, only through action. The first step carries unique power not because it is inherently momentous, but because it breaks the holding pattern of anticipatory anxiety. It shifts processing from simulation to reality, from avoidance to approach, from contemplation to experience. This shift, more than any other factor, explains why things become easier after starting. What appears as a vast chasm requiring an impossible leap often proves to be a slight gradient requiring only a first step. The magnitude exists primarily in imagination. Reality, while potentially challenging, remains far more manageable than the unlimited threats our minds generate in abstraction. The fear of starting never fully disappears. Each new endeavor brings its own uncertainty and risk. But understanding the mechanisms behind this fear provides perspective. The anxiety is not evidence of actual danger, but a predictable response to imagined threat. The discomfort of starting is temporary. The relief and momentum that follow are substantial. Moving from contemplation to action remains difficult. Our psychology resists it, but that resistance, when recognized for what it represents, loses much of its power. The barrier exists, but it is permeable. The first step can be taken, and once taken, everything changes.